Hello and welcome to another episode of For the Love of Sports. My name is Michael Rasile. This is a show where I get to talk about sports, I get to talk about business, and I get to talk about everything in between. Today, my guest is Joe Cobbs. He is the professor at Northern Kentucky University and is also the co-founder of Know Rivalry. Joe, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure is all mine. Thanks for letting me chat with your students the other day. Here to help. That's what we're trying to do. So now I'm excited to learn a little bit more about you, learn a little bit more about what you do, why you do it. The first question I have for everybody on the For the Love of Sports podcast is, why do you love sports so much?
I feel like, and what I teach my students is that it's you get socialized into sports. And for most people, that happens from family member, neighbor, older sibling, cousin, something like that. But for me, it was the media more, surprisingly, because I'm old enough to where there wasn't the kind of media that we have now. Like you had 4 broadcast channels, basically. My family didn't get cable until I was in high school. Ooh. So I don't know if you can see the gray hair if you're looking at the video broadcast, but still on Sundays, we were one of those families that went to church every Sunday, and we'd get home, my parents would take a nap, and I would turn on the TV, and what was on? Football. And so I just started watching football even before I realized that the teams were located in certain areas. So I grew up around Cleveland, but I had no idea that the Browns were geographically close to me.
That's funny. You just always thought that, Browns are on again. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And the other team that was always on, same team that's always on now, the Cowboys, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's
a
given.
It's annoying. But as a kid, I was like, and I called them the Stars for like 2 years until my uncle corrected me and was like, I don't think you're talking about the USFL team, which there was a team called the Stars. And I was like, no. And so then he explained the geography and stuff like that. And so that kind of got me into it. I mean, I was hooked. I love the competitiveness of it and the action and the unscripted nature of it, I think is the quality of sports that I still enjoy to this day.
Yeah, I don't understand why people watch reality TV shows. Just throw on a hockey game. Put on the last 2 minutes of a hockey game.
I'm with you.
I mean, if you're not sweating, you don't love life, in my opinion. Like there's nothing like that, right? Like especially that put on the 9th inning of a baseball game, runners on, 2 outs. Like I have not felt those feelings before. I've been to the World Series. When the Mets were in it a few years ago, I was at the game that they won. I don't know what that emotion was. I legitimately have no idea what that emotion was. I've never felt it before. Really hope I get to feel it again sometime because I would really love if the Mets would win, but I don't know the next time I'm going to get that feeling. And there's just nothing like it. The unscriptedness, I think, is as you put it, is just so important. Like, why are people watching the Kardashians? Like, to each his own, of course, but man, I'm telling you,
it's the best. It's the best reality TV. I mean, I could tell. This is the great thing about sports is we could tell stories all day, right? Any sports fan could tell stories all day. But I'll just tell you one about the unscripted nature. My wife kind of broke the cardinal rule of jinx when we met in undergrad, Miami University, big Miami of Ohio.
I was gonna say not
big
the
hockey
U, was
school,
it?
not the U, not the U. The U is not as good at hockey as Miami. And so anyway. And I worked in the athletic department there for a while as well. And so when I was getting my PhD in Massachusetts, the Red Hawks are in the national championship game. They're up by 2 goals with 2 minutes to go in the national championship. No. And my wife says, I can't believe we're going to win the national championship. And I was like, no.
Just for everybody out there to understand, the most dangerous lead in hockey is a 2-0 lead.
Yeah.
Oh no, man, that's brutal. 2 minutes left. That is brutal.
Yeah. They did not win, but
and we can blame it on your wife. So shout out your wife. Sorry,
it still comes up. Actually, the national champion in hockey this year was UMass, where I went for my PhD, and I didn't let her watch the game. I didn't let her watch the game with me because I was like, "You jinxed it when it was our other alma mater. Like,
that's funny.
You're not watching it."
I love it,
and they
man.
won.
And there is nothing like it. Now that rarely happens, right? Having that kind of a lead in a national championship game with that little time left. Like that is a one in 100 shot,
especially
right?
in college. I mean, you empathize with any
Oh
athlete
yeah.
that goes through losing that, but for those college athletes, and I had worked for the team, a
Oh,
year, 2 years prior, and
oh,
so I
so you knew
knew a
some of
few of
those
them.
kids.
Oh, I
Oh
knew all the
no.
coaches too, and I remember waking up the next day, and you know how it is, like it's like the first thing that comes into your mind, right? Is that game that you watched last night when it
Yep.
was a big game. And I remember thinking, I know how bad this is for me. I can't imagine what it's like for Coach Blasey, who's the head coach, to wake up the next day and be like, I was that close to winning the national championship.
It is. It is
But
brutal, man. There's nothing you can do about it. Yeah, as you said, you can
that's one of the
empathize
great things, yeah,
and you can
about
kind of
sports.
just move forward. The other team now, the way they didn't go to sleep that night, right? Like they didn't have that
No,
feeling of waking up in the morning
no.
because they just never went to sleep. Hopefully, at least, just because that kind of stuff is crazy. But that's why we love sports, man. That's why we love sports. That's why I have this show, because I really love sports and I love talking to the people that dedicate essentially their entire lives to working in this industry, right? It's a crazy industry. Supply is very high, demand is very high, the hours are very long. It's very difficult to get in. It's hard to stay in once you're there. People burn out constantly, especially as you were talking about on that media side. But I'm kind of curious, like you, as you were saying, you got your PhD at Massachusetts, UMass. You are now the professor at Northern Kentucky University. So, I mean, I had a really good time in college, but clearly you just wanted to stay there. So talk to me a little bit. What was, did you always want to be a professor, especially in the sports realm? Did
No.
it kind of just happen that way? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I had no intentions of being a professor when I was an undergrad. And until probably my senior year, I didn't even really have intentions of going to grad school. And although I was a sports fan as a kid, and we talked a little bit about that, I didn't think about sports as a career even when I first entered college. I didn't have a good understanding of what the jobs were in sports, and I knew there was a general manager, and that was about it, right? And the
So
coaching staff.
what year is this, if I'm allowed to
This is
give or
this would
take?
have been 1995. I graduated high
Okay.
school.
So the internet really
Um,
wasn't like the internet at all yet.
no, no, I didn't even have an email address yet. I know that like blows my students' minds now when I talk to them, and I'm
Blows my
like,
mind. How do people do things without
I'm like,
email? Like
you're a
that's my
freshman.
job now.
Yeah, I didn't even have an email address when I was a freshman, and they're like, what?
Oh,
And then
that's
they
too
stopped
funny.
listening to me for the rest of the
Yeah,
semester.
because he's so old. But
So,
anyway.
so I go to college, and really the takeaway from that is that I didn't know anybody that worked in sports, right? Like
Exactly.
I had no family connections or anything like that. And I went to school, and I took a sports marketing class when I was, I think, second semester of my sophomore year, and I was a marketing and finance major. I took the sports marketing class as kind of an elective within the marketing category. And that professor, like a lot of people have these same stories, right? That professor really opened my eyes to the possibilities, and he kind of took me aside and he's like, hey, you're a pretty good student. It seems like you're really excited about this. Like, you should think about contacting our athletic department. They have interns, whatever, right? And I had no clue, until he opened my eyes to this. And so I did. And then what happened was I ended up that summer, I already had an internship lined up with Northwestern Mutual, like the financial company. And it was a great internship. It was like very sales focused, but we got great sales training. And I learned a ton in that internship, but I also realized this isn't what I want to do for my whole career, And there was a guy in the office that was a part-time agent for Xavier student. This is in Cincinnati. Xavier students in University of Cincinnati student, like basketball players that were not good enough to play in the NBA, but they could play in Europe, right? And so I went to him about halfway through the summer and I said, hey, can I, help you out with this agent stuff while at the same time doing kind of what I was doing from an internship standpoint. And he was like, sure. He's like, tomorrow morning, show up at 5 a.m. and we'll get started. And I was like, whoa, like, okay. And he's like, well, Europe, they're like 5 hours ahead of us and we're trying to place players in Europe. And so that's when I do my agent stuff, is like 4 to 8 in the morning. And then I start my, regular job. And so I did, and I really enjoyed it. It led to an internship with the Pistons. So I went up there, worked there. I worked in the athletic department at Miami, at my alma mater, as a student my senior year. And then I got a good graduate assistantship opportunity at Ohio State. And so I ended up going to get my master's at Ohio State while at the same time working in the athletic department there. And then I worked for an agency from there in Detroit. not that represented athletes, but an agency that represented sponsors, basically, and did events for our clients and stuff like that, centered around sports. And then I got the opportunity to go back to Miami as the marketing director for athletics about the time that Roethlisberger was the quarterback. So that gives you some timing. Great timing to be the marketing director when you have a quarterback like that for your team. And so the team was fantastic. The basketball team was doing really well at that point. Hockey team. This is pre that national championship game, but they were ranked pretty much every single year. And so it was a great time to be there. But getting back to your question, I enjoyed working with the interns. I always enjoyed kind of the research side of things. And so we develop fan surveys, and we develop season ticket holder surveys, and I'd crunch the numbers, and we try and get some insights from that. And I started kind of paying attention to some of the research journals a little bit about what they were writing about college athletics at the time. And then I had a professor contact of mine just reach out and say, hey, somebody bailed on me for a class. Do you think you could teach that class? It was a night class. It was a sports marketing class, which is what I was doing every day. So I taught it. And then I got, started to get serious. Like, hey, this is pretty cool. I really enjoy it. I have more interaction with the students than I do like with my interns in this job. And so I like that aspect of trying to help, kind of like you have done, help that next generation. And again, I like the research side. And so, and the other thing from a more selfish or more lifestyle standpoint, which is something that I know you talk about as well, like when you work in sports, and particularly when you work in college sports, or if you work in baseball, like, I mean, you were just working an insane amount of events, and it was fine for me at the time. I was a bachelor. I actually got married while I was the marketing director at Miami, but we didn't have any kids or anything. And my wife was also, she has her own career, and she was, working a lot of hours. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but we got married, and my wife said to me one time, I'll never forget this. She said, when we have kids, are you going to work this many hours? And I was like, I don't know. I never really thought about it, and so I started to think about, what do I want my life to look like? Do I want to be an athletic director? And I think athletic directors are amazing people, but it's not what I wanted to do ultimately. I think if I would have stayed in that college athletic track, I probably would have, aimed for something like deputy AD of external relations or something like that, but being the person at the top that deals with the media, the parents, the league, the controversies. Yeah. I mean, you're just on 24/7. You have to be, and I wasn't ready to make that type of commitment. Family was important to me. And so anyway, I started looking into professor track a little bit more. Just like you do for any career, I started talking to people that were professors and asking them the question you just asked me. And then also, what do you like about your job? What do you not like? What am I not anticipating here that could be a downside? And after I had enough of those conversations, I just kind of jumped in, applied to different PhD programs, decided what was the right sort of fit for me, and worked out really well. I mean, I made definitely the right choice for me in that regard. And NKU is a good spot for me too, because we're in a college of business with our program, and not a lot of sports programs, academic programs are in the college of business. And that's one of the reasons that I'm at NKU. So it's a good opportunity for me.
That's awesome, man. Well, kudos and congratulations. Got to meet some of your students last week. Very good people. And I think it's, I always like asking that questions to professors, because as you said, you kind of have that one professor that sticks out in your head and was like, hey, this is something of interest to you. You should check this out. I didn't quite have a professor like that, but what I did have was, I never forget it. It was my intro to supply chain class. My first semester at Rutgers, Professor Ricci, if I'm not mistaken, Victor, maybe Professor Ricci, I took his night class, and he would come in at, 6 o'clock or whatever. So as 5 o'clock job ends, he probably ate something and got in at 6. And whatever that lesson was for the day, he'd write it on the board and he'd be like, this is what this word means. Just remember that. This is how I applied it today in real life. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, because I had everybody has those professors that are, I don't want to say just professors, but that aren't, practicing on a daily basis. Right. And this guy literally came in and was like, this is what I did today. Here is the example of what we're learning about. And not only was it just reading out of the book and memorizing, but it was, hey, this is how it happened. This is a real life example. And that really stuck with me. And that's kind of ever since then, I was like, I've always, whatever I end up doing, I kind of want to just be like, teach like 2 classes a week,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe like Tuesday, maybe 1 class, like a Tuesday, Thursday kind of thing. And just do that. And like, just be really awesome, of course, but more so just be able to impart the wisdom and actually give that actual like real life, not just experience, but like, hey, this is so real. I literally just finished this project 2 hours ago kind of stuff. And I always, that really resonated with me. So shout out Professor Ricci if you're listening. But no, and that was always a reason why I wanted to kind of just become, I always called it adjunct, and I was told not to say adjunct, say part-time or whatever, but I want to do that one day. I think that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like even for well, the point that you bring up for full-time professors, it's something that I feel pretty strongly about, and I know we're going to talk about the rivalry research that I do. That's one of the points of research, like a lot of students don't think about the fact that their professor, if they're a full-time professor, they sort of have 2 roles, right?
Yeah.
They have the in the classroom role, and then they have a research role. Now, of course, it depends on the institution, but for the most part, that's the structure of like a full-time professor's job. So there, in some cases like me, where they worked in the industry for a while, that is a lot of my colleagues are that way. NKU sort of hires that sort of career path. That's what they look for. But we're not, I'm not doing sports marketing every single day now like I used to. And that's where the research comes in, right? And so in my mind, if I can say, a good professor, their research ties directly to what they do in the classroom, right? So like I do a lot of rivalry research, and my other research area is motorsport sponsorship. And in both of those areas, I'm talking to people that are doing it every day, and I'm, getting data from them. I'm, doing partnerships. I'm saying, hey, what are your problems? How can we gather some data? What can we do to research wise to kind of solve that problem? And if you're a student and you're listening and your professor's not making that connection, ask them like, hey, what do you do your research on? And it might lead to them starting to make those connections, which will hopefully make it exactly what you described, an experience that becomes more real.
100%. And I always, that was just something that I really liked. And it's always nice to kind of talk to people that are doing it, right? Like you, and figuring out, how to impart that wisdom, like get that knowledge, get that information, and be able to disperse it to 18 and 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds in a way that's interesting, that keeps them engaged, especially now in the middle of pandemic. Hopefully like back 9 of the pandemic. I'm kind of crossing my fingers, a little bored of this shit at this point, but hopefully sooner rather than later, we'll kind of get back to some normalcy. But so I do want to then talk about that a little bit. You are the co-founder of the Know Rivalry Project. And when I read it, it didn't make sense, but when I say it out loud, it makes a lot more sense. I don't know. Maybe I say no, K-N-O-W, a little different in my head when I say it. Because I'm reading, I'm like, no, right?
That's the one downside to the.
Yeah. But I do like it.
We were smart, and if you go to Know Rivalry, like NORivalry.com, we also own that domain, and it points back to the correct domain. So we got you covered.
I like that. Fun fact, if you go to relentless.com, it just brings you to Amazon. That's always an interesting one. But Know Rivalry, K-N-O-W, Rivalry Project. I guess I want to, so which came first? Becoming a professor, or what to research as a professor?
Probably, I mean, I had an idea that I wanted to do sponsorship right away, before I even went to UMass. The rivalry as a research topic came a little bit later, after I was already at UMass. But it ties back to the industry experience, because in my job at Miami, I used to have to write radio and TV copy for like the script for the advertisements, right? And then our broadcast guy would voice over the ads. So I'd write the copy, I'd give it to my boss to proofread, and he would insert the word rivalry if we were playing any conference opponent, right? So Miami of Ohio is in the MAC, the Mid-American Conference. So if we were playing Bowling Green or Toledo or Akron or Ohio University or whoever in the conference, Kent State, he'd insert this word rival. And we were friends too. And I'd be like, what? you can't call every single opponent in the conference a rival or it loses all of its meaning, right? So that always stuck with me because it kind of became a running joke between us after we had these debates where then he would just do it to get on my nerves, you know?
I respect that. I respect that.
Yeah, I did too. But then then I go to UMass, you know, and I had already, you know, started working on some sponsorship projects, and the guy who was in the cubicle next to me in kind of the big PhD room was David Tyler, who's the other co-founder with me of Know Rivalry, and he was writing a paper. I think it was on like attendance demand modeling. So like, you know, writing a statistical model to predict attendance. And he was looking for like this definition of rivalry as one of like the regression terms. And he really couldn't find it like in the research literature, not a consistent definition. And he was like, can you believe this? And I was like, oh, that can't be, you know, and then that kind of led to this discussion, you know, that was in probably 2008 maybe or 2007. And it just led to this evolving discussion of, wow, if nobody's doing this, then we're going to do it.
That's pretty cool.
And yeah, and now it's turned into Know Rivalry, and we have a lot of our students involved with it as well, to try and teach them kind of survey research methods and consumer research methods and stuff like that using the context of sports rivalry.
So before we dive into what Know Rivalry is, now I'm kind of curious, like, what's the process like when going to your boss or whoever and be like, we think this is fun to research and we think this will make you money, so let us do it? Like, how does that even happen? Like, I can understand sponsorship. That's been a direct correlation to sports. That's really the lifeblood of all these things, right? Like, we need money. Okay, go find a giant sponsor. The Super League, right? Over in Europe, here's $450 million. Make this shit happen. But if but
that wasn't enough to make it happen, right? For the Super League.
It'll be in a couple of years, don't worry.
I know, unfortunately.
So sponsorship makes sense, but like, why, if it's never been done before, how do you take this to someone and be like, we think this makes sense to research, here's why, and here's how this will benefit you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And without getting, you know, I'm not going to get into the like esoteric details of academia. But it is, I will make the point, it is one reason that the tenure system exists is so that it gives professors the flexibility to decide themselves, you know, hey, this is what I want to research. And as long as I can publish academic papers on the topic, meaning that external reviewers and editors find it important, then you can do it, right? Now, before you get tenure, you know, I published a lot of papers on sponsorship because it was less risky from just from a career standpoint, because I knew I could publish those papers. You know, if I did the work of quality to publish those papers, which I thought I could do, then I could do that. Now, you know, rivalry, it's a fun topic, right? We get that on message boards a lot. Like, wait, a university pays you to research rivalry? Like, why? You know, and we also get that reaction. That's the best job ever.
That sounds pretty awesome. I'm not gonna lie.
But here's the key, and this is how we sort of sell it to some of the grant, like we have grants that pay some of the students that work with us. I mean, one of the biggest problems in our society, and I think we can all agree on this, is the partisanship, right? And the in-group, out-group fighting, like the refusal to kind of work together and just defining
not even work together. Group. Yeah, just like not even willing to talk to the other side. Yeah, right? Like, it's like, so ridiculous to me.
You're defining like your group based on not being part of that group, right? Instead of what is the values of your group, you know? And we've kind of,
well, we're not that group.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's what we've devolved to. And a lot of the social psychology that is the foundation of our research and rivalry is based on that in-group, out-group fighting. Now, it's really hard now there are some great researchers that do it, but it's very difficult to get people to
admit?
Yeah, to kind of talk about how they really feel about sort of political parties or even religion, but people love to talk about sports, right? And it's not, it's still acceptable to use profanities against that rival team, right?
Yep.
And so in that context, we study it first of all, because we like it, and it is fun. I'm not saying that it's not fun, but it does give us insights into, okay, well, what creates this tension? What creates this hostility between groups? And why are like Giants fans particularly hostile toward Eagles fans, but yet not very hostile toward, I don't know, Indianapolis Colts fans, right? I mean, they're both out groups to the Giants. They're equally likely to, well, maybe not equally likely, but they could each win the Super Bowl, which is what the Giants are also going for, right? And so that's what we sort of drill down into, is using sports as a context to better understand kind of this global phenomenon. And then there's a business side to it as well. So even in sports, like from a sports business standpoint, in demand modeling, like where you're trying to predict attendance, like rivalry is one of those factors, and it's not significant, meaning statistically significant in every model, but in most models, it comes out to be significant, meaning that it adds a considerable portion of demand, either through attendance or TV ratings, to a matchup of teams if fans perceive it as a rivalry. We've seen lots of proliferation of sponsorship around rivalries. Some of it activated well, some of it activated extremely poorly, I would argue. And so, and I think it mostly comes back to the fact that we don't have a great understanding of rivalry, which seems a little bit odd because we talk about it so much, as sports fans, but we talk about it on more of a surface level, I would argue, and we don't think about, well, what is underlying those feelings and that animosity toward one opponent compared to another.
Well, the people from Philadelphia are just worse. They're just bad people. So that is what drives most of my hate.
The surface level.
No,
right?
It's not. Have you ever been to a Philadelphia Eagles football game? They're horrible human beings.
I don't think
they
so.
Are bad people.
Not in Philadelphia, for sure.
I have never seen so many smashed glass bottles in a parking lot before. That was insane. I watched people get jumped as they got out of their car just because they were wearing Giants shirts. It was like, legitimately, I do not kid you, they're awful human beings.
Well,
every single one of them.
I'm not going to name the school, but there's a particular school that I feel that way about, where I was on the sidelines as an administrator, and they're throwing batteries, like AA batteries, at our
Eagles
sidelines.
Fans did that. Yeah, Eagles. Well, they got
and
it
the
from
players.
the
all the
fans.
players put their helmets on, right? And I'm like, I don't have a helmet. I'm going to the press box. Like, forget the sidelines. I'm getting hit with batteries. I'm out of here.
It's not great, but that's sports, man. That's sports. But no, I think, and I also like how you kind of tie in the sponsorship aspect to rivalry, because that's true, right? Like, I'm more likely to tune into a Mets game against the Phillies, the Braves, or the Yankees than I am again, like the Mets and the Red Sox. Like, that game's on right now. Like, yeah, I'll get to watching it, but it's not nearly as important to me as some of those other teams are. And then in football, especially, where, you only get, well, now we get 17 games, but I'm watching the 2 games against the Cowboys. I'm watching the 2 games against the Eagles. I don't really care about the football team, but I'll probably end up, I'm watching all these games, but you can tell people are much more excited and amped up about those games. And I guess I'm kind of curious why.
Not only your favorite teams, but also if you do watch a game that doesn't involve your favorite team, either it's a game of high stakes, right? Meaning that it's like a playoff game, or it has some championship implications or something, or most likely it's a rivalry game. You look at how many people watch Army
Ohio
Navy.
State. Yeah, I watch Army Navy. I love that game.
Yeah,
every single year.
I have some family military ties, but that's not why I watch that game.
Bama, Georgia. I watch that game every year. Don't care about either school. I just want to watch that game. That's true. I never really thought about it like that. Yeah, rivalry week in the NCAA is always fun.
Oh, that's my favorite week of the year.
Championship bat, like that is. So I guess, so this idea kind of like came about slowly, it sounds like, or like you guys just figured it out and you're like, shit, we should do this. This would be kind of cool. You start doing it. What exactly is it, and how has it evolved over the years? The Know Rivalry Project.
Yeah. So one of the things, like as a researcher, the first thing that you do on any project is you go and you see what's been researched before, right? And so there was some rivalry work before, but it was mostly like qualitative work that was real in depth about a particular rivalry. It wasn't looking like across a whole bunch of rivalries for commonalities or compare and contrast, right? And then there was some pretty good, really good rivalry work, like geopolitical rivalries, right? So nothing to do with sports. And there's some sibling rivalries, some good research on that. So that's what we did, is we looked at what those other researchers had done. And then because there wasn't that much in sports, the first step for us was just to interview fans, and very open-ended interviews, right? And record the interviews so that we could transcribe them, make sure that, all their work, well, as a media member, like how important it is to get the exact, right? I want to know exactly what they said when I come back to it. And so we did a bunch of interviews across a bunch of different sports with fans, and we kind of used some of our friends, and then we used what's called snowball sampling, just to ask them, hey, do you know anybody that would be good to interview? And we were particularly trying to look at a broad array of sports, but also geographically broad, outside the United States as well, not just in the United States, but outside the United States.
So
we did a bunch
soccer hooligans too?
Interviews. Yeah, we did some in soccer. We did some in Korean baseball, Japanese baseball. We really tried to do a lot. I think we did Indian field hockey even, which was maybe the most, it's very popular, but we don't hear about it that much in the United States. And so anyway, we did a bunch of these interviews, and the main questions were just, what's your favorite team? Why is that your favorite team? What's that team's biggest rival? Why is that a rivalry? What's that team's second biggest rival? And why is that a rivalry? And then what's a team that they compete against that's not a rival, and why isn't that a rivalry, right? And that was basically it, right? And then we sort of, had some follow-up questions depending on what they said. But doing those interviews then allowed us to get a much better understanding of, okay, how can we build a survey to then survey, hundreds or thousands of, now we've surveyed over 30,000 fans. But we had to have kind of that basic core knowledge foundation to know what to ask in the survey, and how to sort of go about it. And so now we have a survey. If you go to the website, knowrivalry.com, like one of the first things you'll see is take the survey. I would love it if any listeners go and they take the survey first. It is a little bit long.
It's a little long.
It is a little bit long. So you've got to prepare yourself. 5 or 10 minutes it's going to take you to get through the survey. And then look at the results, right? Because if you look at the results first, it might bias you a little bit.
I looked at the Giants results, and then I started doing the Mets survey. So I will finish the Mets survey without looking at the Mets results. I promise you that.
All right. There we go. And that's a good point. Now we started with college football in 2013, I think, is when we first collected the survey data. And then we expanded into some of the North American pro sports, the 5 major leagues, including MLS. And then now we've expanded. We've got a WNBA survey that's available. We've got a NWSL survey that's available. We've got English Premier League just went on, Bundesliga, Women's Super League, Australian rules football, Indian cricket. We actually have results for Indian cricket that you can see on the website. The IPL, Indian Premier League.
Anybody that's listening, if you think LeBron James is famous, like those cricket players in India, they are ultra mega superstar. I think the captain of the Indian like national team is like 4 times as popular than LeBron James. Like, it's just ridiculous. And we hear literally nothing about it. I hear a little bit about it. I went to Rutgers, and so anytime I would take the New Brunswick train station, which means nothing to you, but it's right in Edison, which has a high Indian population, all the advertisements would be for cricket. And it's like, what's going on? So it's like stepping in another country. It's pretty cool. But anyway, I apologize. So you're global with this entire survey, sounds like. Very global.
Now, the results that you can get on the website are just for the North American leagues and college football. And we do have the Indian cricket results up there. And so we just started collecting data for some of the foreign league, or what we in the United States would consider to be foreign leagues. But that's sort of the next step. Comparing what we've learned in the United States to what we learn in the rest of the world. And then also we've sort of discerned these 10 elements of rivalry that are, every rivalry doesn't have the 10 elements, but there's some combination or some rivalry recipe of these ingredients that creates the rivalry. And we really want to start drilling down on that and looking at how do different recipes result in sort of different levels of either animosity or respect, or a little bit of both, or, friendliness, or certain ingredients that just never really spark, and it just, some of the ingredients are there, but it just never really becomes a rivalry, right? And so that's sort of our next That's our next step. But
It's
right now on the website, you can go to the team pages, like you said you did, and you could see, well, what do Mets fans, say, how big of a rival is the Braves, and then you could look and you could see, well, what do the Braves say about the Mets, right? And it's kind of fun to go back and forth and see, well, I think this team's a rival, but they don't think I'm a rival, what's up with that?
I noticed that with on the Giants page, because again, I didn't look at the Mets one yet, but on the Giants page, the Eagles, the Cowboys were very, very high. The Washington football team was there, and then the Patriots fans found Patriots fans found the Giants more of a rival than the Giants found the Patriots, which was really interesting, obviously because of those two Super
very
Bowls. So
unusual,
it's just like
too,
it
for
is
the Patriots, because most teams, most fans will allocate some points to the Patriots just because they've been so good for so long, right? But the Patriots hardly ever reciprocate. But there you found a little anomaly.
Yeah. Well, 18-0. Oh, whoops, 18-1. Oh, that stinks. But so I guess like with that, like it was really interesting to kind of look through some of this stuff and try and digest it a little bit more. And I think another one, another I guess emotion maybe we can use that you were talking about prior, like one that also exists is jealousy, right? Like the only reason I consider the Yankees a rival to the Mets is because they're like, a subway ride away, but also because I'm super jealous of a franchise that can competently run itself, right? Like, and then you see the Mets and how they're always just kind of putting their foot in their mouth and stumbling over themselves constantly. And it's like, why can't we be like them? Like, they're always good. They always win. They're across the town. Like, they're across the street. How can we not figure that out? So I'm sure the Mets, and I will find out later, I'm very confident the Mets find the Yankees a much bigger rival than the Yankees find the Mets, of course. So I guess what has this project, as you said, the research has been going on since 2013. As you said, you kind of have some next steps, but what has this succeeded at? Like, what are some of the things that, I guess, what did you put this information out in the world? What did you try and find from it? And did you find that, or did you find something you didn't think you were going to find? I said find a couple too many times in that sentence. Did you understand it?
I think so. You correct me if I get off track. One of the things that we found that is not necessarily surprising, but we were able to support it with data, was that animosity, and we define animosity using some measures of prejudice. And so when you think about prejudice, the root of it is just prejudging, right? You're judging somebody without necessarily knowing them, right? So prejudice and discrimination, right? Discrimination in relationships. And so when you take the survey, you'll notice those questions now that I've kind of prompted it. And it'll ask you, like, how upset would you be if your son or daughter became a fan of, and it'll put whatever you said was the rival team, and it'll, how upset would you be if, your spouse was, or would you consider a spouse that was a fan of the rival team or something like that, right? And those are the discrimination questions. And we actually took that from racial and cultural discrimination research, and we just adapted them to sports. Like, we didn't make up the items. And so one of the things that we found was that the animosity or hostility toward rival fans is highest in the NFL compared to the other leagues.
Really? Even college sports?
Higher than college sports. NFL is by far the high. Well, I shouldn't say by far, but it's statistically significantly higher than the NHL, and those two are much higher than the other sports. And part of our hypothesis for why that is, we don't test that. We haven't tested that aspect yet, but is just the physicality of the sport, And then you might say, well, what about college football? Like, that didn't rank as high as the NFL, and it's basically the same kind of physicality. But I think in college, you sort of you've got these alumni and students that are involved in it. And while there is a lot of animosity, I think there's a level of respect. Again, this is not our research, but this is what I hypothesize as to being behind what we found. There's like a level of respect that's maybe not there when you talk about the NFL and professional sports, right? And so without that level of respect, you sort of feel more entitled, I guess you could say, to show animosity toward that rival fan, just because you don't respect them. The envy, you brought up an interesting point, and we've separated out sort of our measure of prejudice to where some of the measure represents envy, or you called it jealousy, but it's kind of same thing, right? Is that envy? And then part of the measures scorn. So like when you think of scorn, think of like big brother, little brother situation, right? Where the big brother just kind of has scorn for the little brother, like, just leave me alone, right? Like, I don't want to be bothered by you. Like, that's the idea of scorn. And so it'll be interesting to see how that comes out as it relates to teams that are sort of dominant in the rivalry on the field.
Oh, yeah.
And so we'll see. But getting back to what we've already learned, so when you look at our 10 elements of rivalry, one thing that we've discerned, and we're really interested in testing this internationally, but is that there's two particular elements of the 10 that are highly related, highly correlated to that prejudice and discrimination. And those two elements are unfairness, which we describe as like discrimination by the authorities, meaning the league, right? So everybody thinks the league favors the Cowboys, or in the MLS, a lot of fans think the league favors the New York teams, or the Galaxy. And I'm a big Formula One fan. Like everybody definitely they favor Ferrari, the governing body.
My dad would probably my dad would mother F you up and down the street if he heard you say that, though.
I mean, they do.
He thinks Lewis Hamilton gets everything that's put on his plate. He doesn't even think he's a good driver. I'm like, Dad, you're just being ridiculous now. He's like, no, I hate that guy, blah, 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 blah. It's like, all right, man. So that's really interesting. See?
But see how fired up people get about that aspect.
It's funny.
The psychology behind it is, if you feel like your team is being slighted, then the scales aren't even, right? It's unfair. And so you can be extra hostile, and that will sort of even the scales, right? Because you think the scales are unbalanced. So that was when that's present in a rivalry. This is what we found in our research. When that feeling is present in a rivalry, it's particularly hostile. The other element was cultural difference, right? Or difference in values is how we define that. And that's just a fact that it's harder to empathize, right, with somebody that you don't share certain values with.
That's like Notre Dame, Miami, Catholics versus convicts kind of thing, right?
That's the example I use in class when we talk about that. Actually,
it's a good example to use.
Yeah, it is. And actually, I tried to buy one of those shirts, like a while ago, because I wanted to wear it in class.
That's funny.
And I found a couple knockoffs, but I really wanted like an original, because I think the original has the schedule on the back of whatever year that was, the Notre Dame schedule. Anyway, that's a separate story. But that's a great example of that factor, right? Like clearly different values, right? I also use El Clasico with Real Madrid and Barcelona, because one is sort of nationalist Spain. It's the capital of Spain. They have the royal title that was given to them by Franco and all of that. And then you've got the separatists, Catalonians exactly. And they want to be, it's totally different sort of set of culture and values. And it just plays itself out in this tremendous soccer rivalry. Or football, maybe I should say, rivalry.
Yeah, we're in America. It's fine. I don't think anyone's gonna get angry at you. But yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting to kind of just see all these things, and like, I know they all existed, right? Like Catholics versus convicts. I was like back in the 80s. Like very clearly, cultural differences played a huge role in that, right? It was Notre Dame. It was good old boys. They're going to church on Sunday. They have the priest in the huddle with them, kind of shit. And then you have that Miami team who, I mean, let's be honest, it was really just because they were black. They were considered convicts, right? And so like that kind of led, and they played a lot tougher and they were stronger. So they kind of had that quote unquote.
Well, they embraced,
thug.
they embraced it, right? They wore the combat uniforms and everything.
And so that just made both sides hate each other even more because, of course, the culture and the actual values that come with it. So I guess like in general, I have some words written down here, and I want to know if these are the ones that I'm thinking of. But like, what makes a rivalry? Like, how does it work? And I guess why does it work like that?
That's a great question. So within the 10 elements, one of the other things that we've learned over time, and these 10 elements, originally I think it was like 15, from the interview. We did all these interviews, we coded all the interviews, and we looked for commonalities, and we probably started with a list higher, more than 15. But then we started to try and drill down, like, oh, are these two really the same thing? And so that's how we sort of arrived at these 10. And we're always looking for, something that we're missing, right? Any good researcher knows that I don't know everything about the topic. And that's a great thing about Rivalry. I could never know everything about Rivalry, and my students teach me stuff about Rivalry every day. And so, but within those 10, we have enough data, and we've done enough interviews and kind of been studying this long enough that there are sort of a few solid rules. And one is that you need consistency of competition. You have to sort of play that team enough over time that it creates the opportunity. It's not just the consistency, but then that's correlated, or it creates the opportunity for these conspicuous moments or these defining moments within the rivalry, right? It just makes sense. The more that you interact, the more that likely, or the better chance that there are for these moments to happen. And so that's two of the elements that are really key to that question that you asked, like what makes a rivalry, is you have this consistent conflict, this consistent competition, and then within that consistency, these moments arise that kind of every fan remembers, right? And then another one of those elements is conspicuous characters, which is like the stars or the coaches, or sometimes it's the owner. In the Cowboys Redskins rivalry, it goes way back to the owners, and when the Cowboys were trying to get into the NFL and the Redskins were trying to block them, and there's lawsuits and stuff, stealing the fight song and stuff like that. But it's those aspects that form this narrative, and that's really what a rivalry is. It's a narrative, and the reason that certain teams aren't rivals, like I'm here in Cincinnati or greater Cincinnati, my university's right in metro Cincinnati, but on the Kentucky side of the river. Here in Cincinnati, I mean, you look at the Reds, for example, the oldest professional baseball team. They have played the Brewers a lot, but the Brewers are not really a rival because there just hasn't been those defining moments that have occurred. And while there's been some characters on each side, they've never, gotten in a fight, or they haven't overlapped, or there's just no narrative to that competition between those two opponents. And so when we look at the elements, you can look at that list on the website and you can pick out, oh yeah, I could see where this comes together in a narrative that makes a great rivalry. And that's why Catholics versus Convicts is so great, because you just described a narrative in 3 words.
Yep.
And everybody understands it, right? I mean, everybody's a college football fan.
Yeah.
And so that's where, like, pushing our research toward the business side, that's where we argue the business side comes into it, is that if I understand rivalries well enough, I can understand what makes authentic rivalries. And I would definitely caution against trying to create a rivalry artificially, because some teams have tried to do that, and generally it hasn't gone well.
What was the terrible one? What was it? UConn and UCF, the civil conflicts, and everyone's like, "What is this?
Yeah,
what are we doing here?"
But what you can do, I would argue, is that if you understand the elements, is as a marketer, you can start to sort of promote those elements individually without kind of calling it a rivalry, and then you can kind of put all the ingredients together and see if the spark happens, right? And if it doesn't, then that's fine. But if it does, then you can recognize, okay, what's causing the spark, and then I can promote it in a responsible way. And so by knowing what elements lead to a lot of animosity, it also helps you understand, okay, maybe calling, and I know Catholics versus Convicts was a bootleg, campaign. It wasn't the athletic departments doing that.
It was the athletic departments. Come on.
That would, well, definitely years later, they're all about it. Yeah, for sure. And well, they might do it, but I would say it's probably somewhat irresponsible because of what can result. Our research shows that that you can get that's what leads to some of the violence that we see in Europe, or that's what I'm speculating. We don't have data on that yet, but I'm speculating that once we get that data back, that's what we're going to see, is that what's driving a lot of those rivalries is the difference in values. We call it disparate values, but it's just basically different cultural values, and some sort of feeling of discrimination by the league or by authorities where they're favoring Real Madrid or they're favoring Manchester United. And I think that you'll see that will lead. Now there'll be other elements in there as well, without a doubt. But I think that that's where marketers can look at those elements and say, okay, well, I can kind of promote these elements and fans get really excited about that aspect of it, but it might not lead to some antisocial outcomes that I don't really want to produce.
Yeah, right? Don't really want to deal with too much of that. Never need literal blood on your hands. That's a little ridiculous. Right. It is just sports, guys. Believe me, this stuff runs my life too. But like, I'm not going to get into a fight over anything unless it's an Eagles fan. So, a couple last points that I'm kind of curious about. I'm just very curious from your research, like the long-standing traditional rivalries, right? Like Yankees Red Sox from 19 whatever, because Babe Ruth, blah blah blah, versus kind of ones that are starting to pop up. And I don't think it's a rivalry yet, but I think in the next few years, Ohio State, Clemson, they don't play each other during the year, but it just turns out they're two of the four teams that are always making this college football playoff, right? And they've had some incredible games over the last couple of years. But I wouldn't quite call it a rivalry yet, but I can see it getting to that point, right? They've played, 3 times in the last 6 years, 5 years, something like that. I continue, like, at what point, when can you start to consider something a rivalry? Or I guess, like, what, is there a necessary length of time in any of this? And like the Reds and the Brewers, right? They've been playing each other for however long, but nobody cares because it was such a long span where nothing happened, right? The Reds had the big red machine. Yeah. And I don't think the Brewers have actually ever been good in my life. I'm not totally sure about that, but how does that play into it? Just the time factor of all these things. How does that play into rivalries? Obviously from your research.
Yeah. The way that we look at it, we are pretty careful about not defining rivalry for the fans. We let the fan decide what they think is a rivalry. Now we have a definition of rivalry for our academic papers and stuff. But we just tell them, you have these rivalry points, you can allocate them however you want. But we don't want to superimpose sort of our view of what it is on them before they take the survey. We want them to kind of take the survey and then decide. Now, how that gets back to your question is, so like I'll still occasionally get in friendly arguments with people who say this is a rivalry, and I'll be like, no, it's not, and sometimes I'll even, when I'm maybe being extra annoying, I pull up data on my phone from the website and say, here,
that's a little too much.
Not a rivalry.
That's kind of funny.
But it is a rivalry to the fan.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I can't tell them what is a rivalry. Like if they think it's a rivalry, then it's a rivalry. Now, getting closer to your question about the timing is, I think that if you have enough meetings, and what is enough meetings? It kind of depends on the sport, right? So like in football,
guess the bigger the game too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The more that's riding on that game. And so we would call one element that we haven't talked about yet that is relevant to this is the competitiveness, right? And by that, using your Ohio State Clemson example, those are the two most competitive programs, along with Alabama. Those are the most competitive college football programs since the playoffs started. And so if that continues to happen, then I would definitely expect to see those fans start to allocate. I'm sure they probably already are, allocating some points, those that are taking the survey now, to each other. Ohio State Clemson actually has a little bit of history because Woody Hayes' game where he punched the player happened to be a bowl game against Clemson. But they don't play very often. So that's an example where you don't have a lot of consistency, but the consistency that you do have, like in the last few years, has been extremely competitive, right? Very high stakes. Another good example of that is Cavs Warriors. So Cavs Warriors, if you go to our NBA page, you'll see it's still rated, according to our data, as like the 4th or 5th most intense NBA rivalry, but that's because on the website we aggregate the data, from when we started collecting NBA data, which probably would have been 2016 until the current data.
That
Eventually,
was a pretty important
was the
time
middle
period
of
in that rivalry.
yeah. Eventually, we'll maybe have a time bar, a slider on there where you can look at how the rivalry evolves over time, right? We'd love to have that at some point. But the point being, like, fans that are filling that survey out now, they're probably not, Golden State fans aren't allocating points to the Cavs, or if they are, they're allocating, or I should mention, we give fans 100 points. They can allocate it to any of their opponents. That's the main measure on the website. Out of their 100 points that Golden State can allocate, those fans are probably allocating 1 or 2 to the Cavs, if that, right? And probably the same way with the Cavs. And so I think you do have these rivalries that are kind of like pop-up rivalries that certainly exist for a short period, but if they lose that consistency, then it's gonna fade, over time. And the less history that you have going in to sort of that period, the quicker I think that it fades off. So like Cavs Warriors fades off right away because there's just not enough. There's not enough history. But you look at Ohio State, Michigan, there's still the consistency in football, but Ohio State's won a lot of games in a row. But that rivalry, it's maybe fading a little bit, but it's got so much history that it can maintain a period of maybe less competitiveness than would be ideal for a rivalry.
I also assume one of those teams threw batteries at you. Was that the story from before?
No.
I would assume Michigan fans would throw batteries.
Team in West Virginia, actually. So, yeah.
Maybe that was a Mac thing then.
It was a Mac thing.
I love Maction. Give me more Tuesday and Wednesday night
football. It was a weeknight game too.
I'm in for some Maction, baby. That is
impressive.
Fun. One word that I saw on the page for rivalry. So you talked about prejudice, you talked about discrimination, Schadenfreude.
Yeah,
I don't think you really brought that up yet. So for our non-German speaking friends, if you don't mind explaining what that means, because you have a really nice definition on the website. But like, what exactly is that, and how does that contribute to a rivalry?
So Schadenfreude is like a measure of joy in other people's misfortune, right? Yep. So something bad happens to somebody, the Eagles, and you're really happy about it.
Cloud 9, baby, let's go.
And so it's a little bit, well, it's certainly a separate construct or a separate idea from discrimination in relationships and prejudice, and that's why we measure it separately. And one of the ways that we measure it is by asking people, we have these like scenarios where it's like a natural disaster happens to the practice field of whatever, and it inserts your rival automatically in the survey. How does that make you feel? And you've got all these different descriptors, right? And levels, intensity of how you feel about it. The opposing coach gets indicted for tax evasion. How does that make you feel? Right. Yeah, that's one of the
that's a deep cut, man. Jeez.
The rival team superstar, gets an injury that's not life-threatening, but will keep him out for a while by no fault of his own. And it's kind of like, how do you feel about that, right? And so
and
it's
people
interesting.
know, and your data is anonymous, so let's make sure that everyone knows, right? So like when I answer that question like a horrible human being, because I am, you don't know that was me, you just know that's thrown into the data. So anybody out there listening, go take the survey. Don't worry.
Well, when I see, there's also room for you to add open-ended comments. So when I see all those comments about what you did to Eagles fans, I'm gonna know it was you. So I mean, it's a fun measure. We've got it's just a bar graph on the website, but eventually we'll get like a fun infographic, that we'll use for that measure. I'd like to do that in the next iteration of the website. But now that if you're listening to this and you weren't kind of aware of Schadenfreude in the past, like now you're going to find yourself like feeling that way. And it adds a little bit of guilt to it now that you actually are conscious of like, oh, you're,
no
you're
an
East Coast. You're an East Coast. Oh, let me add this in. This reminds me.
East Coast bias?
No, but close.
That's a good one.
So we did a test of where the most animosity is among sports fans by region, and we used the U.S. Census regions. So the Northeast, the Southeast, the Midwest, the West, and then we made Canada its own region. I know that's not U.S. Census, but there's Canadian teams in our sample, and we have a lot of Canadian data from fans. And I know not all Canadians are the same, so forgive me for making Canada only one region. But the most animosity amongst sports fans across all the sports. So we grouped all the sports together and we just compared the regions and how they measured and our different scales of animosity. Northeast, by far the most animosity toward rivals. What do you think was the least amount of animosity toward rivals out of those regions?
Well, Canada, you said hockey was very contentious. So I'm assuming it wasn't Canada, because we all know every Canadian is a good person, right? So it's probably, I'm going to go with it was not Canada. Do people care about sports on the West Coast? Like, I feel like they don't actually care about sports.
I think that's a pretty, I'm with you. I would have guessed that too for the same, I would have had the same reasoning, but it actually was Canada. Like,
oh, no shit.
Canada had the least amount of animosity. And you even said, like, well, we
Yeah.
generally think of Canadians as friendly, but your line of reasoning was good because hockey was a high hostility sport, but still the Canadians, when you just do it over all the sports, you know, they had the least amount of animosity. So
yeah, I guess, like, who do Raptors fans hate? Like, who do Blue Jays fans, like, they probably hate the Yankees a little bit, but like, there's no other
even
team
within
for them to
the
be
hockey,
like,
you know, they have that strong, you know, I think they have really strong rivalries within hockey. And if you look at our NHL list, even though I think there's only 8 or 9 Canadian franchises, right? Something like that.
Yeah, I think 7 or 8. I don't know.
They're well represented in our top 10 rivalries list within the NHL, but that's measured based on the intensity of the point allocations, you know, between the two fan bases, rivalry points. But when you look at the measures of kind of discrimination and prejudice, they're intense rivalries, but they're still not, you know, they're like, no, I wouldn't mind if that person joined my family by marriage. Like, that's okay. Or I would hire somebody who was a fan of that, or I would work for a boss who was a fan of, you know, like they were kind of willing to get over it. Whereas those of you from the Northeast were like, no, I'm not getting over this.
Not getting over that. I am not. All right, last question. So this is a little longer than expected, but Joe, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thoroughly appreciate you answering all this for me, and then hopefully everyone enjoys listening to it. But one thing about rivalry, I also just want to bring up one rivalry that's not a rivalry. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. That's not a rivalry. If you lose like 80% of the time, I don't know. The game just has a name. That doesn't make it a rivalry.
Well, do you want me to get my phone out and show you the data?
No, no. It's what they're like. What the last like 50 games? It's Oklahoma, I think it's really lopsided. 6. It's a joke.
You know, we have a list on the website of the most unbalanced rivalries, and I'm going to look it up in college football. I think it's on the list of the most unbalanced.
Like Oklahoma
State
never
number
wins.
2. Yeah. It's the number 2 most unbalanced because Oklahoma State fans allocate 63 points of their 100, and Oklahoma fans only allocate 15 of 100 points.
That's that big I'm sure Oklahoma and Texas is a little bit.
They
heavier.
allocate a lot of their points to Texas.
Yeah. But that's that big brother, little brother thing, right? Like, I'm curious. Don't tell me Mets. Don't tell me Mets. I'll see that later. But I'm sure Mets Yankees is very, very similar to that. But mostly one thing that comes with rivalry is I'm a very positive person, but usually it's a lot of negativity that comes with rivalry. I hate this team. I hate them, and I hate the people that root for them, right? How do we use rivalry for the power of good? And how are you trying to do that? Just like outside of sponsorship and all that, like what can we do to kind of make this, like, you know, a little bit more keep the competitiveness up, but just a little more cordial, I guess, if we could.
Well, say. I think this is a great, you know, kind of closing question because you know, we've all gone through COVID, right? And one thing that COVID has taught us, although we shouldn't have needed this lesson, but we did, is that COVID doesn't care what color you are, doesn't care, you know, whether you're male or female. Like, I guess it does care a little bit about age in terms of the side effects for sure, and whether you have a pre-existing condition. But whether you're going to get COVID or not, like, it doesn't matter, right? So we all sort of feel like we're all in this together in a lot of ways.
Well, we did for a couple months, but the news stations kind of drove us a little bit apart. But anyway, you're on a whole
nother topic.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic. Yeah, but you're on a good roll. You're on
another day. Another day, we'll talk about that. So in using rivalry for good, like we've talked a little bit about sort of the disparate values or the different culture, right? The cultural differences and how that really drives people apart, and there's a lot of hostility. But on the flip side, another one of the 10 elements is synonymous values, or cultural, which we define as cultural similarity, right? Where we hold very similar values. And that can lead to rivalry, because if you hold very similar value, this happens in a lot of like high school rivalries.
Mm-hmm.
It's the neighboring high school. Sometimes they're very different, but a lot of times they're really the same. And the way that you differentiate from that group is by beating them, you know? And so it becomes really important to you, because you kind of care about the same things and you have a lot of the same values, but you want to sort of exert your superiority and competition over them. So that opponent becomes very salient and top of mind to you, right? More important than other opponents. So that contributes to the rivalry. But even though it contributes to rivalry, there's tons of research that shows that when you point out the similarity between people, it lowers kind of the animosity, right? So that opponent might be really important to me, and it might be really top of mind, and it might be a threat to me, you know, advancing in the championship or winning the conference or division, which is what makes it a rival. But it's less hostile because I recognize, or that similarity is top of mind. So getting to your question, I would say that one of the ways that, and I'll give you an example to close, is when you point out that, hey, you know, we really hate each other on the field, but you know what? We both care a lot about NFL football, or we both care a lot about, actually the SEC does a great job of this, as much as I hate to admit it, in college football. But that annoying chant, SEC, SEC, which annoys all of us that don't
just
like
means
schools
more.
in the SEC. Yeah, I know. It's so annoying. Such a good marketing slogan, but
It
it's
is
so
really
annoying.
good. It is really good.
But they're creating this, what we would say is a superordinate identity, right? Like, it's beyond your team. It's looking at the commonality that we all share. And I think that's one of the things that makes sports so great, right? Is we might root for different teams, but the fact that we can have a conversation about all of these minute details of, you know, the NFL playoffs in 2005 or something, shows that we clearly share similar interests, even if we're on different sides. And so I think that understanding that, and the marketers can influence that, you know, and how you promote the game. We use that SEC example. The example that I'll give locally is University of Cincinnati and Xavier University. Both, they're only 3 miles apart here in Cincinnati. Great college basketball rivalry. So when the pandemic started here in Cincinnati, somebody left a tip at like a local restaurant for like $1,000, and they put, I think it was on the UC side, and they put like "Go Bearcats" on the bill, and they left $1,000 tip. Well, the restaurant like tweeted out a picture, put it on Instagram, whatever, and within like a couple days, somebody left a tip at the same restaurant for $1,000.01, and it said "Go XU." And since then, over $20,000 in tips that we know of, the media started tracking it, like the Cincinnati Enquirer, the paper here, started keeping track of it, that we know of, where people left tips with either a "Go UC Bearcats" or "Go Xavier" message. That's a perfect example of like the rivalry is driving, you know, these well, you could call it a donation, I guess. It's a pretty big tip, right? But to the people who really need it, right? Those restaurant workers are the ones who've been affected the most during the pandemic, and that rivalry, or that passion to one up the other side, that salient out group, that rival, is what has raised all that money for those groups. So I'd love to see more of that, and hopefully with our work we can move toward kind of encouraging that as well, with some of the findings and how sort of the best practices for how that can be implemented in an authentic way.
Yeah, I think that's great. I hope that it can move in that direction outside of the rivalries I have. I want to keep those the same because I'm pretty happy about them. But, you know, just generally, let's get a little more cordial with this stuff. I think it's important. But Joe, I'm sure we can continue to talk. I'm sure I have many more questions, but we'll cap this at a little over an hour. I sincerely appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Of course.
I appreciate being here.
Professor Joe Cobbs, there's an S at the end, at Northern Kentucky University, co-founder of the Know Rivalry Project. Where can we find more information? Where can we find the survey? Where can we find the statistics? Where can I find why Eagles fans are the worst? Give me all that information and give it to the people. I'll also put everything in the show notes for everybody that is listening, so you can just go ahead and click on the link as well.
Yeah, great. The website we already mentioned, knowrivalry.com. That's KNOW rivalry.com. We've got a Twitter account, and so we put results out on Twitter as well. It's at Know Rivalry. Those are probably the two best avenues. We do have a LinkedIn page, which is more kind of about my students and the involvement that they have, but definitely check that out if you'd like to see how the students are involved in the research. Those are probably the best avenues. And you can contact me too, like me and my co-founders at the University of Massachusetts. Our bios are on the website, as well as our Twitter handles and different ways to get in touch with us too. If there's something that you see that you don't agree with, or something that you see that you're like, wow, I really think they should look into this, like, send us a note.
Love it. Love it. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on. Everything will be in the show notes for everybody. So appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Right. No problem. Bye, everybody.